Hello everybody, welcome back to another video by Jay Bowman. Today I'm looking at one of my favourite synthesizers, which is the EssenceFM Mark II from Kodamo. The reason for this video is that for a while I've been using other synthesizers, my Mask 1 and some other FM synths, and I came back to the EssenceFM last night. I turned it on and to be honest I'd forgotten how good it sounded. So what I wanted to do now is look at some patches which I rediscovered last night, which it turns out I'd made months ago, sometime last year, and completely forgotten that I'd made them. And some of them have some interesting features, so I thought that might be a useful opportunity to talk about the sound and the patch design on the EssenceFM. So that's what this video is going to be about. So I'm just going to turn on the EssenceFM now. And as of the latest firmware update, you get that little fireworks display, which is quite cool. Although I did used to like the old Kodamo logo that came up instead, but that's the new startup screen. So by default, I'm starting in patch mode. I think as of the latest firmware, you can actually set it so that it'll start on a particular patch, a particular voice that you've made, possibly. But as of now, this is just where I start by default. So I'm going to go into voice mode. When you get the synth, I think it comes pre-installed with banks A to G with factory sounds. And then what I did is I went to bank J, I think, and started making patches. So this was really my first experience making patches on an FM synth. So some of these are quite basic, uninteresting, but looking back now, more than a year later, some of these patches do have some interesting features. So what I'm going to do is just go through these patches, and when I find something interesting, I'm going to talk about it. It's not going to be particularly methodical. So I'm just going to scroll through. So this patch, J Gamelani, I'm just going to look at it quickly because I think this is probably the first time I started to get to grips with the looping envelopes. So we just have 4 operators sounding, so two operator stacks. And you can see from the display that the carriers 1 and 6, the envelopes are looping, and you can see if I go into the envelope section of each of those, you can see the section that's looping there. So I take the loop off just to demonstrate. So obviously the modulators are not looping, so you get that initial strike of the gamelan sound. And then you just get the looping sine wave. But actually, yeah, there's some feedback on operator 1, so I'll just mute operator 6. And I'll mute the carrier. It's actually quite a nice sine wave, sawtooth type of sound that we're getting from the feedback sine wave. Nice, so that's a very basic patch. I don't think there's any modulation going on otherwise, but that's great. So let's move on. So let's look at this patch, J switch. So each time I press the key, I'm getting a different timbre. You might think it's quite an annoying sound, but I guess it could be useful to develop this kind of technique and use it in a more musical patch. So we have operators 6 and 2 are muted, so we just have a 4 operator patch here. Let's look at the mod matrix. So you've got 8 slots. And I think at the time I made this patch, I probably didn't realize that you could scroll up, because the initial screen just shows 6 slots and I've used all 6. But then if you scroll up, you've got 7 and 8 as well. So a viewer on my channel pointed that out to me, but I didn't know that at the time. So we've got some modulation there going on to the feedback level, but I think the most significant modulation here, so slot 2 is LFO1 to operator 1 frequency multiplier, but the ratio there is set to 0, and you can see the output value is 0. So that's not actually having any impact. Let's look at slot 3. So that's LFO1 to operator 2 frequency multiplier. So that is having an impact. So if we look at LFO1, and of course at the time I made this patch, there was no LFO2. So that's why all these modulation slots are using LFO1. LFO1 is set on random mode. And the speed is 0. And that means that each time I press the key, it's just picking a random point on that wave, which is effectively giving me a value between 0 and 127. If the speed was on, then it would start, each key press would start in a random place in the LFO wave, but then the LFO would carry on playing. But because it's at 0, you can see from this line, it's just picking a random point and sticking on it. That's great, and if you choose different waveform, obviously that gives a different effect. So if you go to square, then rather than this kind of smooth curve of every value between 0 and 127 being available, here you should just get 0 or 127. That's not quite the case because this square wave is slightly curved. So there are some areas there where there are some intermediate values. If you scroll all the way through the waveforms, you can get a harsh square. And that is just giving you 0 or 127. Or I think 126, so yeah, you can see the input value there. And it's quite a powerful mod matrix in my opinion, because you've got this offset feature and ratio as well. So the output, I set the ratio to 4%, so we're either getting 5, an output value of 5, or 0, and that is obviously determining the frequency multiple of operator 3. And if I increased the ratio, it would have a more extreme effect. So that's a ratio of 34. So that's that patch, which uses the mod matrix in that way and the kind of random feature of the LFO. And I can see I've used some of the experience I gained from that previous patch on this new patch, Nearly Pad. I'm just using the LFO to affect the frequency multiple of operator 1. That's quite a similar patch. Okay, this is a kind of stab sound. So here you see we have 3 2-operator stacks. Interestingly, I'm using a non-sine wave modulator, sorry. Let's see. I've just isolated this stack, and let's play with the waveform here to see what effect that's having. So I'd obviously chosen that particular waveform for the modulator to have that kind of timbre. And then the modulators for the other stacks are all the same, so they're pretty similar stacks apart from the frequency multiplier of this stack. The carrier's at 1.5. So if I just isolate that one, you can hear that's adding that kind of overtone to the sound. And then if I go to the final stack, it's an even higher overtone. So the 3 together produce quite a rich sound. And then I think I made similar patches using similar structures. So that, I'll just show that because that is using the envelope in a kind of one-shot mode. You just press the key. And it goes through the whole envelope. Now, it sounded like there might be some effects on that. So let me just check whether that's the case. No, there's no effects. Yeah, I thought there might be a delay or something, but it looks like I'm using the mod matrix there to make that kind of effect. So LFO1 is set to noise, and that is modulating the feedback level. So we've got operator 1 is at a fixed frequency. It's using the noise wave, but it's also using feedback on itself, which you generally would use to get to noise. And then the mod matrix is affecting that sound. So if I turn off the other mod slot, you can hear the effect that's having. And the second mod slot is using the operator 1 volume envelope to yeah, so I see. So that is another aspect of the sound which I thought was delay. So it's kind of feedbacking into itself to modulate the effect of LFO1's having on the volume of LFO1. So it's interesting. So you can here get some quite interesting feedback options using the mod matrix. The other thing I should say is obviously that you'll notice as you change voices, it doesn't cut off previous voices, and that's great. I mean, that's partly a feature of the fact that you have 300 voices on the EssenceFM, but also the way it's implemented, it's very, very nice in that way that new patches don't cut off previous patches. So let's look at this patch, glitchy, Glitchy. So I don't know if you can see that looking at the operators, they show the kind of amplitude envelope, and you might be able to just see it flicking through the operators. So what I've done is, I think I started to try and use the EssenceFM almost as a wavetable synthesizer or wave sequencing synthesizer. So what I've done is if I look at the amplitude envelopes of each of these operators, I've kind of staggered them one after the other. So I'm pressing the key once and I'm getting that kind of wave sequenced sound. And obviously in the EssenceFM you've got this great selection of waves. So operator 1 is using this kind of vocal waveform. Operator 2, operator 4 is using a different vocal waveform. The same for each of them. They're all using those vocal waveforms until you get to the 5th operator in the sequence, which is using that harmonic wave. And then the last one's a sine. That's quite an interesting sound, and I think it's probably atypical. I haven't seen a huge number of FM patches that were constructed in that way. And if you try and use the EssenceFM in this kind of way, you run up to some limitations. It's not designed to be a wave sequencing synth or a wavetable synth, but at a push you can get it to do that kind of thing. So I'm not using any modulation there. Obviously you can change the waveforms for each of these operators. In a way which will change the wave sequence. So that's just an example of some of the ways you can push the EssenceFM engine. Okay, let's look at this sound, J Wavetable. Again, this builds on what I was saying previously. You can see that even though obviously it's not a wavetable synthesizer, you can set it up in that kind of way. So again, what I've done here is I've staggered the envelopes in a way which gives the effect of a transition through a wavetable, kind of so that the amplitudes of the different waves are fading in and out at the relevant times. Now, I've set each of the envelopes in one-shot mode. I don't know if you need to do that to get that effect, but what I've noticed is that obviously it goes through one cycle and then stops Now, if you wanted to make it more like a wavetable synth, which is being modulated by an LFO, you could have these envelopes looping so that the sound would kind of restart. So let's try that. So if I it's a bit fiddly because I've got that one-shot mode on and I've triggered loop, so it'll just loop forever actually, which is obviously why I didn't do it that way when I made the patch in the first place. But then you've also got to kind of set it by ear where the loop point is. So yeah, it's not set up as a wavetable synthesizer, and you can't really use it in a satisfying way in that sense, but at a push you can kind of get towards that sound. And as I say, it's got this great selection of waveforms, which makes it quite tempting to try and use it in that way. Probably the designer would say that the point of FM is to get that kind of timbral variation through FM modulation, which you have a lot more control over, rather than kind of wavetable transition. But I think it kind of shows that there is a lot of flexibility here, and you can kind of push at the boundary between FM and wavetable. Let's see. Yeah, so these are my patches with the J in front, and then I've loaded some from a kind of DX7 sound bank I found online, and the engines of the EssenceFM and the Yamaha DX engines, and they're not one-to-one compatible. But you do get some interesting sounds by converting them. Right, I'm just going to flick through, see if there's anything else. Okay, let's have a look at this patch. It's quite an analogue sounding patch. So what's going on? We're using sawtooth waves for the 4 operators which are sounding, and there's a bit of detune on them. There's a bit of detune, and also I've routed velocity to the fine frequency of operator 1. So that's giving you quite an analogue. Quite an analogue sound there, with the kind of phasing. You can hear there whether you have the overlapping notes that they're not one-to-one, so you are getting a semi-realistic analogue type effect there. Am I using the filter at all? Yes, I am. That is interesting because I would say the filter in the EssenceFM is not designed to replicate a subtractive synth, and the implementation is slightly unusual for people who are used to kind of traditional filter envelopes. And I think it's a 6 dB per octave filter, which again is unusual for analog synths, but here it's coming together and making quite a, I would say quite a realistic VCO, VCF type of sound. Obviously, as you get higher up there, you can hear that some aliasing. You don't have to get very high actually for that to be obvious. But if you play it in that range, it sounds nice. So there might be some modulation going on in each of the voices. Yes, there is. So we're getting a bit of frequency modulation from the LFO as well. So it's this kind of subtle vibrato. As you play it higher, that aliasing or whatever it is becomes really noticeable. Okay, hopefully this has been interesting. I just thought it'd be quite cool to just have a look at some of these early patches I've made, which I had forgotten I had made. So please give me a like and a subscribe if you've enjoyed this video, and thanks very much for watching. I'll catch you on the next video. Goodbye.